I'd like to call to order regular council meeting number 1518 for June 30th. And in honor of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Village of Pemberton acknowledges that we are meeting within the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. So a bit of an opening statement. This meeting of council is being held virtually with all meeting participants attending via electronic communications in order to adhere to the provincial health officer's orders, respecting physical distancing requirements as a measure to prevent the transmission of COVID-19. Council members will be involved in and participate in the meeting virtually as they would in person. For those members of the public in attendance, please note that this meeting is a live webinar and is being recorded. A recording of the meeting will be available on the village's website following the meeting. Members of the public who wish to ask questions, pardon me, during open question period at the end of the meeting will be able to do so, and I will provide instructions at that time. Council members attending the meeting are required to verbally advise the chair of when they are leaving the meeting and return to the meeting so that this can be recorded in the meeting minutes of the meeting. For clarity, if a council member does not verbally advise the chair but is observed to be absent from their video feed for an extended period of time, and their video feed remains turned on and it is unclear to staff whether they are present in the meeting, the council meeting member will be marked absent from the meeting until such time staff observes the council member to reappear in the video feed. Okay. Are there any amendments to the agenda? Okay, seeing none, can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve the agenda.
Councillor Zant, seconded by Councillor Antonelli. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Adoption of minutes from regular council meeting 1517 from June 16th. Moved by Councillor Caddick, seconded by Councillor Noble. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Any business arising? Seeing none, we don't have a rise with a report or business from committee of the whole. No delegations. So it takes us right to number 9, reports, Office of the CAO. Ms. Gilmore.
Good morning. I just wanted to take this opportunity. There I was at a meeting, I guess it was a week and a half ago or so. And then I received some new updated information just on bus capacity yesterday. So I thought I would take this time just to provide you a short overview. I believe at our last council meeting, the mayor reported that we had a couple of BC Transit meetings that we had attended. One was on the Thursday following our last meeting. That was sort of more a staff one. And really what the discussion is around obviously funding for BC Transit. Although, and this was with all municipalities in BC. And actually, furthermore, there was TransLink representative and a BC Transit representative. So they didn't say for certain. Well, obviously, every community has a different fee structure as far as what their numbers are going to look like, having to reduce service or stops the fare collection. So a couple of the things that they said they're going to do to try to help municipalities. One, the federal government has announced 1.45 billion in funding. Some of that will be able to be used for transit. There hasn't been a decision or discussion based on between the provincial government and the federal government. There also will be healthcare that comes out of that funding. So it is somewhat targeted for local governments to help offset some of these costs, but they haven't worked through the details yet. So there could be some funding coming from that avenue. In addition, BC Transit themselves are looking at a couple of different measures they can implement themselves. One is what they're calling a lease fee holiday. So they are going to, for a 6-month period from July to December, they'll not be charging lease fees on the buses. And this is a holiday, they say, but this won't be a requirement of municipalities to have to actually pay that back later. It's just going to be, they're going to absorb those costs. Furthermore, I did discuss this last time. Every municipality, it was probably 2-3 years ago, when BC Transit decided they were going to roll out 3-year budgeting, is that they wanted to be able to provide to municipalities this budget, but also have this provision of reserves to allow for less fluctuation in what it looks like year by year. So they've created this reserve and they're allowing municipalities to use those reserves this year for operating. to offset some of those potential shortfalls. So what BC Transit is doing right now is every year, which you will recall, they give us an annual operating agreement, which is an AOA is what they call it for the short form. Typically we get this earlier in the year, sort of March, and BC Transit's operating year is from April to March. And so that's sort of the reason, that's the timing we get it. We have not yet received that AOA, but we should be expecting that in the next few weeks. So some of the things I talked about as far as the reserves and the lease fee holiday will be incorporated into that, and then I will be bringing it to you for your approval so that we can move forward or any questions you may have. So that was some of the initiatives that they're wanting to bring forward to help municipalities. It was interesting being on the call because we're on the calls with the City of Kelowna, Metro Vancouver, and they're talking millions of dollars in loss. And I think it's still, even though we may have thousands of dollars of loss, I think it's still comparable because we have such a smaller tax base. And in my opinion, it could be worse for smaller municipalities. That was definitely the theme that came through from those smaller municipalities when we got into question and answer period, is where is the help for the smaller local governments? The one disadvantage we have, and I believe I spoke to this last meeting as well, is that we don't have the ability to change or reduce our operations. We have very limited transit as it is. So we don't have necessarily the abilities that those larger municipalities have to have some cost savings. So they did acknowledge, again, that they don't have any answers right now for those smaller municipalities, but they are going to be working with us through our annual operating agreements. So that was sort of the summary of that particular meeting.
Questions?
If I might, you mentioned you had some transit numbers.
No, I do not have any transit numbers yet. What I had, sorry, is they made an announcement yesterday, shared some information with us about the number of passengers that they are going to allow. And they've actually stepped up that capacity number effective tomorrow, July 1st. So for our area, typically, so the lighter duty buses that we see going for our local service, we are going to still have 50% in that ridership, but it's the larger buses that their capacity will be nearly equal to full. So at this time, when we look at a heavy duty, that would be between 30 and 40 people on the bus. And regularly, it would be between 64 to 81, which includes standees. So they're pushing up a little bit more. Although not mandatory, they are recommending, BC Transit is recommending the use of masks if you cannot distance yourself. So that will take effect starting tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions on transit? Okay, go ahead, Nikki.
Do we want to, so that was on the BC Transit, do we maybe have,
You want to
yeah, motion that the verbal report be received?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Moved by Councillor Zant, seconded by Councillor Antonelli. All in favor, opposed, motion carries. Friendship Trail.
So we did apply to the BC Active Transport Infrastructure Grants for a portion of the Friendship Trail along Pembina Farm Road East that is within our jurisdiction. I think it was roughly between $350,000 and $400,000 that we had applied for. We received notification last week that we were not successful in receiving that grant. So what we are proposing to do is, what was it, earlier this week, there was another announcement. It's a second intake of the Community Culture and Recreation Infrastructure Stream and the Rural and Northern Communities Infrastructure Stream, both part of the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan. And trails are also an eligible expense in that. Typically, this is what we received. We applied for funding for other infrastructure for recreation, such as the second soccer field. And typically they're larger numbers that you get, you would apply for grant funding for. So we're going to potentially massage that grant application a little bit more and see what we can add to that, but we will be bringing it back to council. The other piece of, we didn't receive the funding for the park and ride, and this is also part of that stream. So we're looking to apply for either of those or both of those, and we will be bringing forward information and a report to council just to discuss those. We have studies on master plans on both of those, as well as cost estimates. So at that time, we feel that given all of our extra workload at this point, those make the most sense, and they are actually top of the list to make application for. So it's unfortunate. One new little bit of information we did apply for a grant for ICBC, which is just road safety improvements. And that's for a speed reader along Pemberton Farm Road East. So they're going to fund 50% of a speed reader. And this is actually going to be a movable speed reader. So if we needed to use it in other locations, we could move it. And the benefit of this particular device is that it actually also does your traffic counts. And so we'll be able to use that to know exactly how many people are using that road. I'm not 100% certain as to whether or not it tracks the individual speed, but we are going to be looking at installing that, purchasing that and installing that in the next few weeks. So at least in the meantime, we will be able to add some traffic calming measures, albeit not necessarily what we were hoping for, as the grant application for the trail also included the flashing crosswalks at the rec site. So we are going to be trying to make application again. And I did actually just receive update that it does track speed. So that's for your information.
Thank you. Any questions?
Mayor Richmond?
Councilor
Ms. Gilmore, I'm just curious about the movable speed tracker.
Yep.
I guess first question, is it on a trailer?
I imagine it's one of those boards that you'll see when sometimes Ministry of Transportation will come and do traffic control along Portage Road,
Right.
or anywhere else, to try to get an understanding of where that traffic is. So it's going to be mounted, apparently it's mounted to a post. So,
Okay.
but it will be movable.
Okay.
Like we can put it in other locations.
That's great. I like the idea. My concern was the security around it, if it can be disabled somehow so that it can't be stolen.
Yeah, I would imagine there would be a boot or locking mechanism if it was more movable, but it looks like it'll be affixed to a post, so we'll be.
But then still be able to move to a different location.
Yeah.
And will our staff be able to move that, or do we have to get a hold of our contractor, Miller? Is it Miller Capilano?
No, it has nothing to. It'll strictly be a Village of Pemberton asset, and we'll be responsible for that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So, unfortunately, so first of all, do we have any sense what the timeline of the new grant application turnaround will be?
No, we just received that. Let me double check here. That announcement was on Thursday. So staff are currently reviewing all of the information on that, and we'll be moving it ahead as soon as we're able to bring something forward. I don't have the details of that at this point.
Okay, I'm just wondering, the reason I ask is I'm just wondering if there's interim measures we want to look at for Pemberton Farm Road East for safe pedestrian bike travel along there while we're waiting to be successful on our second application.
I think it would be a bit of a challenge considering that road gets quite thin through some parts, especially with that rocky outcrop. The only thing we would be able to do is paint a line to allow for that. I mean, I can take that back to staff and we can sort of troubleshoot that a bit. As far as spending dollars on it, the one thing I am concerned with is anything that we had allocated for that particular piece of road was coming from reserves. And that's actually what we're using this year for cash flow, if need be. Taxes are due on Thursday. So we'll start to get an understanding of what that looks like.
Yeah.
And we'll be able to make some other determinations on when we move forward with some of our other projects that are specifically tied or either larger in nature or are tied to our reserves.
Thank you. Any questions?
If I might,
Yeah,
Is
go
there,
ahead.
yeah, Nikki, is there anything we can do in the short term to alleviate the concerns of people out in that area for the road condition?
Not at this time. My understanding is that anything that we would be doing, the significant portion of the road when you come in, before you go up to the plateau, is that piece of road going out just past where the townhomes are, it has significant issues with the subbase, and it needs a complete re. So if we're still planning on wanting to do some of the other upgrades, so we would just be putting some money there to rip it up and then do some larger work. So there is an ability potentially when we go out to RFP to see if there are some other improvements but at this time, I mean, we've identified that are asking people to go slow. There's quite a bit of signage out there that we've put in. I see some people at the townhomes have also put in some slow signage. And hopefully the speed reader will reduce the speed, but we just don't have the funds right now to do any temporary patches. I think it goes a lot deeper than that, from what I've been advised.
So if I might just follow up, Mayor Richmond, is there not an opportunity just to put some gravel that compacts in there to make the holes less problem for traveling on, just to help fix that up? 2 or 3 loads of gravel compacted would, I mean, I'm trying to find a solution because it appears that this could be late fall or even to next year if we don't get the grant, and it's certainly a concern for people in that area.
Mm. Well, I'll ask staff to go and have a look and provide some options. You know, it's funny because we have the traffic calming issues and the speed bumps, and we're looking for that, but potholes also do slow people down, but then it causes the safety issues, right? So do we leave the potholes and hope that people go slower, or, but we can definitely have a look and think of some options and see how we can make anything that really stands out as being unsafe, and see what we can do there.
Really appreciate it. I know the people out in that area would be thankful for that. Thank you.
Okay, can I get a motion to receive?
Ted?
Brian? And Suzanne, all in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, thanks, Nikki. We're going to go to Corporate and Legislative Services. Ms. Fraser.
Oh, you're on mute, Sheena.
Sorry. Thank you for having me. I'm presenting a report on open meetings without public presentation resolution. As council is aware, we've had a number of ministerial orders over the last couple of months, which have provided permission or the authority or ability for local governments to hold meetings electronically, whereby all members of council can attend electronically, and also to hold meetings electronically without the public in attendance. And this is in response to the various public health orders around gatherings and social distancing that have been issued as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in my report, I provide a little bit of background on how we've progressed over the last few months. Recently there, on June 17th, the new ministerial order was presented, ministerial order number 192, which replaces 139 from May. And it removes, the other thing too that the other previous ministerial orders gave us was the ability to give 3 readings and adopt bylaws at 1 meeting. And again, these were all put in place to sort of alleviate the requirements of the Community Charter and the Local Government Act to allow local governments to move forward with business on a somewhat regular basis given these unusual times. So the order that was issued on June 17th removes the ability for a local government to give readings and adopt bylaws at 1 meeting, except in the case of certain financial bylaws. And that is done in order to allow local governments to meet some of the revised deadlines that have been put in place. Those don't affect us because we were able to adopt our financial bylaws within the time frame, the normal time frame of May 15th. It also requires that local government make best efforts to allow the public to attend open meetings in person while ensuring the public health orders and recommendations are being adhered to. And it establishes that if a local government is not able to accommodate attendance of the public in person, a resolution must be passed stating the reason for holding meetings, continuing to hold meetings without the public in present, and noting how openness, transparency, accessibility, and accountability are being met. So the government also provided guidelines, document guidelines for open meetings, electronic meetings, and timing requirements for bylaw passage under Ministerial 192, which is different from what they've done in the past where we didn't really get any guidelines. This is a document that was meant to help local governments look and evaluate whether or not they can move forward with holding meetings and allowing the public present in person, and also looking at how to hold electronic meetings, and is there a way to have just a component of people, members, council members attending, and what we, sort of some guidelines of what we look at to make those determinations. So in looking at that, staff looked at our situation here in Pemberton, and given the limited space that we have in Municipal Hall overall and the size of council chambers, we've determined that it is very difficult for us to continue to open up and allow the public to be in attendance in person at our council meetings at this time. The guidelines indicate that when you are looking at space, to consider that you give at least 5 square meters of unencumbered space per person in a room. So based on the size of our council chamber, with incorporating the table in there as well, we've got 30 square meters, which basically means we would be able to have approximately 6 people in attendance at our council, in our council room. And then what that would look like when you have to put the 2-meter social distancing in, it may actually reduce the number of people who can comfortably be in. The other thing the guidelines set out is establishing exits and entrances in one way, implementing cleaning protocols before, during, and after the meeting, having someone on the door to assist people to move in and out, and establishing spacing that is 2 meters apart. So when we were looking at all of this, based on our space, it's really not something that is achievable at this time. So what we're recommending is that we continue to meet electronically without the public being able to attend in person. And we've prepared a resolution to that effect, which provides a bit of a preamble that explains our position and our rationale for doing this, and also enables us to be able to address the transparency, what are the words? Transparency, accountability, and the one areas that the guidelines have asked us to address. Further to that, one of the things that has been suggested is that councils look at adjusting the order of their meetings to try to move the business of the meetings to the front of the meetings or to the beginning, to allow for the public to attend if they're going to be attending electronically, so that the business of the meeting moves forward. And they don't have to wait around in the event that they're attending electronically. So what we're put forward for council's consideration at this point is a resolution to amend the agenda order of proceedings in business by moving consideration of bylaw readings before mayor and council reports, so that all of the staff reports can be dealt with in one group. And that we do that for July, for the month of July, and look at possibly amending the procedure bylaw to make that change on a more permanent case. That will help us allow for staff to attend just for that portion of the meeting, and the public, if it's of interest to them, can stay for that portion of the meeting, and they don't have to wait for their item, for instance, if it's a bylaw, to go through at the very end. So we did get legal review. The guidelines and the ministerial order was a little bit confusing. And through our lawyer, we found that there were other municipalities who were trying to grapple with how best to present this. So we did get some legal guidance on this. And the resolution is before council for consideration, the 2 resolutions. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Fraser, questions?
If I might.
Councillor Craddock.
So that means people won't be able to hear the mayor's report then if they leave right after all the business is done? I don't think that's fair to the mayor.
It is a bit of a highlight. Any real questions? I mean, I was on the call with Minister Robinson when they were announcing the ministerial order. We discussed at the SLRD as well. And I get it. And then we certainly know the size of our council chambers and that, but I don't know. And for me, I do look forward to getting back into a room. And I like the fact that through this webinar, we are getting attendees and it is available on our website. So I like that fact, but I miss the live interaction of it, and I'm already zoomed out. And if this is the case now through the summer and then into the fall, it sounds like we could be doing this for quite some time. So I'm happy to support this. But as the months go by and weeks and months go by, I'd like to look at other options, even if it might mean considering a budget being put towards renting a bigger space like the Great Hall or something, or at least for some meetings. But yeah, those are my thoughts. I support the direction of staff here, but I do look forward to getting back together. Go ahead, Ms. Fraser.
If I may, through the mayor, we did investigate and take a look at options in terms of holding meetings in a larger facility. The options were the Great Hall. Right now, there's only 1/3 of it available. And again, with the physical spacing, distancing requirements, the layout would be council all along one long line, and we would probably have to look at bringing in some sort of sound system, and we would still need to facilitate the meeting through electronic means, because again, with the physical spacing, it may be a challenge for staff and council and the public to be in attendance. We considered the SLRD boardroom. We could accommodate council and 3 other people at the, which would mean either staff or the public. So we would still require the electronic meeting to allow for either the staff or the public to attend. And then we did kind of consider the school gymnasiums, but the costs, especially over the summer with the schools not being open and custodial, would probably be cost prohibitive. Council did, look to keep our budgets at a very tight, and so we would have to, if we were to move forward, we would need to look at what those budgets, what that cost would look like for sure, and come back with some numbers for you to make that happen.
Mayor
I have a
Richmond?
comment.
Councillor Antonelli, then Councillor Craddock.
Yeah, the feedback I've had is that people appreciate the electronic meetings because they can hear what's going on while they're at home. So, making dinner or whatnot, and they don't have to come into the building to stay informed. So.
Yeah, no, I think it's been pretty practical for that. And I think we should continue that. I would rather have both than just this, though. You know what I mean? Those who want to stay at home and watch, perfect. But those that prefer live could come and we can get together. Councillor Craddock.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, with that said, Mayor Richmond, is there an opportunity, and this may be off the wall, is to have 2 or 3 people attend in the council chambers and a couple of others maybe at home, and we could share off so that, like you, I'd like to get back to face-to-face meetings. I think it's important, but at the same time, I want the community to be able to see this. So it's just a thought. I'm like you. I'm not a fan of Zoom. It seems to make the meetings a lot longer for some reason. And anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's kind of what I'm thinking, is a hybrid of some sort. And maybe the SLRD boardroom might be a good one to consider down the road. Let's carry on for July. We don't have regular business meetings in August. So let's get through July with this, but yeah, I would like to consider other options. Maybe the SLRD boardroom would allow a hybrid of having live discussion, but the technology is all there, so it could be on video for people. So, I don't know. Let's see how things change over the weeks to come. Councillor Zant?
I just wanted to echo Councillor Craddock's comments that I like that idea of doing a kind of a hybrid idea where you could have some council members in the chambers and then public still attending with staff. I like that idea. I think maybe in the fall we should reevaluate that to have a list or a role of, say, Amika and myself show up, and then Ted and Leah are electronic, and then we just everybody has their turn being electronic and then being present. I like that idea, Councillor Craddock.
Like I said, I think we could even find a space for all of us. It's more about getting the public to be able to physically attend. That's the biggest problem. But.
And I also would like to say, I echo Councillor Antonelli's comments too, where a lot of people like listening to it in the background, and they don't have to be actually in attendance as well. So I think this electronic webinar has done a lot of good as well.
Ms. Fraser?
Oh, just we do need to consider, again, just going back to the cost, even if you were in person at a council meeting, in order for you to be able to be participating on the Zoom webinar, you would still need to be on Zoom and on your computer, even though you'd be in the council chambers. Otherwise, everybody can't see each other. So it's just, these are the logistical things that we would need to work out. We can certainly investigate and see how that would all be put in place.
So how about we pass this resolution and ask staff to come back when we come back to our meetings in early September, that we have another conversation, see where we're at with the province as well, and in the pandemic, and maybe we could have another conversation and see how we're feeling about it at that point.
I'll move the recommendation.
I'll second.
So that's recommendation 1.
Yes.
Yeah. Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. And now the second recommendation is to temporarily change the order of proceedings. Moved by Councillor Zant, seconded by Councillor Noble. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Fraser. Development Services, I believe Ms. Pedrini and Mr. Chalmers are going to be joining us.
Yes.
So we'll just give it a moment here. We're going to be looking at our community amenity contribution policy.
Good morning, Mayor Richmond. I believe Ms. Pedrini is going to open the presentation.
Okay. Ms. Pedrini, are you coming on, or are you there?
There she
There she is. Hello.
Morning.
Morning. Go ahead. I'll turn it over to you guys.
Okay. Good morning, Mayor and Council. So the purpose of this report is to present to Council a draft community amenity contribution policy, which we will refer to as a CAC policy, to serve as a framework for defining and negotiating voluntary community amenity contributions with developers of residential and mixed-use projects seeking rezoning. So the village presently has a CAC policy, excuse me, that was adopted in 2007. And this current policy stipulates expected amounts and anticipated recreational community needs. Over time, it has been recognized that there were some issues and limitations with the current policy. So through a few different in-camera meetings, staff has had the opportunity to discuss with Council some changes to the policy and revising it so that we could negotiate CACs basically on a case-by-case basis, using density bonusing and or alternatives based on how other, basically best practices or how other municipalities are addressing amenity contributions. So this initiative has been on the work plan for many years, and so it was basically recognized as a priority in 2016 and had to be set aside in 2017, and unfortunately has remained on the work plan till this time. And although we had hoped to bring this back, and we had a council resolution to bring this back to the committee of the whole format, because we're not holding those meetings right now, this is being presented to council today. So basically, there's an understanding that new development brings new requirements for village infrastructure and amenities. And although the village is, welcome to accommodate good development, we also recognize that it is unfair that for the new development to become a financial burden on existing taxpayers. So it is acknowledged that new development should pay a reasonable share of the cost of new infrastructure and amenities that are needed to accommodate additional growth to the village. And so there's basically two main tools that a local government can use to ensure that new development pays its fair share. And these are development cost charges and community amenity contributions. So I know you're all familiar with DCCs, and also on our priority list this year is to update our DCC bylaw. But those are costs that are collected and can only be used for water systems, sanitary systems, roads, drainage systems, and parkland. And as far as community amenity contributions, these are funds that are voluntarily offered to the village when someone is seeking rezoning. And these funds can be used towards recreational amenities. And in our current policy, we've named a swimming pool complex, an arena, outdoor skating rink, water park, skateboard park, etc. So given that a few of these listed amenities have now been achieved by the village, it is timely to update the policy and also to review it to ensure that the village is collecting voluntary community amenity charges as prescribed by the province of British Columbia. So at this time, we are presenting for council's consideration an opportunity to gain important public facilities, services, amenities through voluntary contributions from proponents in the rezoning process. And again, I'll just reiterate that the policy that Cameron is going to go through in just a second will basically serve as a framework to define and secure community amenity contributions through the rezoning process. I'm not going to go into all the information that was provided in the report about community amenity contributions and how the province sort of allows local governments to collect. It's there for your information, but I am going to turn it over to Cameron now to just sort of go through what we've put together and to explain our approach.
Thank you, Ms. Pedrini, and good morning, Council, Mayor and Council. So just a little bit of background on community amenity policies, because they range wildly throughout the province. Amenities have become a standard practice. I'm sure most of my working life has been working in some way or another with amenity contributions, and yet amenities really started outside of the framework of any statutory tools to do it. So what used to happen 20 years ago is you would start negotiating, and the municipalities would use their contract powers and their ability through a rezoning to entice benefits for the community. Over the years, the Local Government Act in particular has started to introduce more tools to local governments, but it's not the sort of thing like a DCC framework. So the Development Cost Charge Framework, which is really well scripted and talks about exactly how you have to arrive at any charges or levies or those sorts of things, what you need to do to justify to the electorate, the development community, and even the inspector of municipalities is all really clearly laid out. Amenities are still kind of out in this netherworld. They're getting much more refined with things like affordable housing contributions, and the local governments have been given some really powerful tools to incorporate affordable housing. But when it comes to things like parks and recreation and other things, there's still a fairly limited suite of tools available. And what often happens is, in my experience, in smaller communities, it's really difficult to come up with an amenity framework that kind of replicates a DCC structure. And the reason for that is you could have two nearly identical projects located very close to each other, and one might have good pipes in the ground and good road in front of it and all the sidewalks in place and be pretty much ready to roll. And the other one might have need for offsite infrastructure upgrades, might need a significant frontage improvement and other things. And, unlike cities where, often you go into a city and the engineering conversation is very minimal because they've anticipated the development and it's an infill, so there's already pipes in the ground. In smaller communities, there tends to be more stringent things that can come up throughout a development process. The margins are typically a little more dicey, it's a little more unpredictable, and I think when it comes to amenity contributions, in terms of what informed this general approach, is that they need to have maintained some flexibility to be able to accommodate different scenarios, whether they're significant offsite improvements or changing market dynamics, project viability, and all of those sorts of things. So we're in a slightly different backdrop than some of the big urban cities for sure, and even some of our larger, more urban neighbors. But that said, amenities are a really important part of the development process for a municipality and a community. And it is something that the village has done in the past. They've done it in several different ways. And I suspect that going forward, there'll be several different approaches to capture amenities in different projects. So what we wanted to do was try and put a bit of a framework around that so that there's some consistency in more in the process, in the approach, and how they're determined and how they're executed and administered, more so than what they actually are. And before I dive into the policy, I would say, one of the things Ms. Pedrini mentioned is that in the past there had been kind of a list of preferred amenities. The fact that that list is not in this policy does not mean that having those aspirations or goals should not be listed. They really should, and council should from time to time develop a companion list of preferences and amenities that a lot of them now could be derived from Parks and Trails master plans and some of the policy work that's happening. But, as things move forward, there's nothing wrong with council having a list of prioritized community amenities that they'd like to work towards and incorporate that into this process. But codifying that in sort of like a DCC structure and then backing out an amount doesn't really achieve typically what you would hope it would achieve in a context like this. So the policy that we put forward, which I'll walk through very quickly, is a negotiation-based policy. That's how most amenities at the end of the day are ultimately derived. What we've tried to do, and what's really important in this policy, is we've created three key definitions. The first one is a community amenity contribution. That is what this policy is intended to achieve. It's intended to draw community amenity contributions voluntarily through the development process for developments, mostly residential, that create lift in land value. That's an important term to remember. The second definition is community benefits. And actually, maybe I'll talk about community benefits in a second. I'll talk about project requirements next. So every project will have requirements that they have to do to make the project work. A lot of them come from things like the Subdivision and Development Control Bylaw, which obligates certain servicing improvements. But what also happens is, as per the examples I mentioned earlier, there may be a requirement to do offsite improvements or other things to make the project work. And the reality about development is that there is a finite level of cost that any project could absorb. So, those are not going to drive the consideration of amenity negotiations, but they do have to be considered. But another important one is what we're calling community benefits or community benefit contributions. And that kind of sits in the middle of the community amenities, which are the important community attributes that are not required, but are amenities for the community, and the project requirements. And so an example might be that if a developer needs to provide a water line to his project, but in providing the water line, if it was extended and upsized, it could provide additional fire flows to an existing community. The developer needs to do it, but it's also providing a benefit to others if it incurs an additional cost. And that additional cost is what we would consider a community benefit contribution, where they're doing more than they have to do for the benefit of something other than their project. So in the context of those, really what the policy intends to do is, as the developments move through the the development process, there's almost always some discussion around amenities. There's always discussions right at the outset. That always happens. But it's really impossible to kind of dial those in any meaningful way until we get through some level of staff review and understand the requirements and the potential community benefit opportunities that exist. So typically community amenity negotiations start very early, but kind of get teased along throughout the process. And then they're usually one of the final pieces that really comes together. So what we've tried to lay out here are some of the things that the village will consider throughout that process, but particularly in the negotiation. And, you know, so it does pay some regard to the reality of the development business and project requirements and potential community benefits. So if there is conceivably a finite pot of money, we look at how that gets allocated between the requirements and the benefits to inform the discussion. In larger projects, we've built into the policy the ability to do pro forma analysis. So every development project has a pro forma, which is basically a projection of the costs and revenues. It's a very important piece on the development side of the fence. It's the key to accessing and leveraging financing. It's the key to really the whole process. And if the pro forma doesn't show an acceptable level to the investors or to the banks, then the project won't proceed. And there will be instances, I'm certain, where projects won't proceed because they're not financially viable. And that will always be at the discretion of council. But on larger projects, we want to make sure that the village is getting its fair shake. And, you know, in the past, I have from both sides, both representing government and representing development projects, have been involved in discussions around shadow pro formas. And it is an important tool sometimes to understand what value council would give a developer by rezoning the property and how that value is being apportioned back to the community. So we've built in a lot of those tools that we're not running pro formas on each project isn't likely going to happen, but we are going to, as part of those negotiations, ensure that developers are accountable for what their projects that lift value, where it's being allocated, and we're going to be very accountable to the community to make sure that a portion of it comes back. So by providing some definitions of what a community amenity is, that's not exhaustive or exclusive. It's intended to be something that's negotiated, and it could flex with council priorities. Just practically, the policy makes it does allocate some different roles. Typically, the amenity negotiations happen at a staff level, but the amenities are only and always set by a council resolution. So in an ideal world, what happens is that when the first reading report comes, it will list out the amenities that have been negotiated and the means by which they will be secured. And this is one area that I think a little additional attention in the village would go a long way, is how these are committed to and how they're secured. So it's very common to have amenities really come in two different forms. One is the amenity is actually delivered at the time or as a prerequisite to rezoning. So if someone offers a cash contribution towards an affordable housing fund or something like that, those funds are typically due between third reading and adoption. What's more common, however, is that in larger projects or in projects that might have more than one phase, is that the village will use either its zoning powers to create, like it has done at Sunstone and the Ridge and perhaps other places, that certain densities or certain lot sizes are permitted unless amenities are provided. That's a good tool. So that would have to be set clearly before first reading as part of the zoning structure. But one of the ones that happens that is very typical of larger projects or multi-phase projects is land development agreements and phase development agreements. And there's a strong similarity, but a significant difference between the two. Phase development agreements are one of the newer tools that have been introduced in the Local Government Act to allow municipalities to index amenity contributions with zoning approval over the life of a project to a period of, I think, 20 or 30 years. So there are some sunset horizon clauses and other things in those. And then land development agreements are very similar agreements in terms of laying out exactly what developer obligations are required before either subdivision or building permits are issued, and clear targets for what has to be delivered. So for example, if it's a 3-phase project and we've agreed that there'll be, a park in phase 1 and a playground built in that park in phase 2, and a contribution towards a new trail system in phase 3. Those are all laid out by phase. The goal of from the municipality's perspective is that prior to public hearing, there's a very clear roadmap for exactly what community benefits and amenities are being delivered with each project, and exactly how they're tied to the project, either by covenant or by dedication at the time of rezoning. And that's really, structurally what the policy does. I'm not going to go clause by clause through it. It's intended to be written in a fairly simplistic way. And again, just to close, I would regard it as a framework. It is a framework. There will be times where certain projects bring in different considerations, and we need to maintain some flexibility and adaptability for the municipality to adjust. And the case-by-case basis sometimes is deemed as not the fairest approach because it doesn't have the rigid predictability. But my experience is the development community and the community both benefit more by the case-by-case approach because each project is going to bring in its own different considerations. And as long as amenities factor highly in the conversation from the beginning right through, it is the best way to ensure that each project provides its proportionate share of amenity back to the community. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I'd be open to any questions you may have.
Thanks to both of you. That was a very clear report. I'll open it up for questions. There's no questions? Ms. Pedrini, you have a question?
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I was just going to add that we do recommend that the development industry be consulted. And now that we have this draft framework in place, if council is supportive, we'd like to go out to the development industry and either set up a Zoom meeting as a focus group or contact individual developers by phone. Anyways, just try to get some feedback on our approach at this point.
Yeah, that's important for sure.
I've got a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just was wondering about the wording of number 5. I think it could be changed to make it a little bit more clear that the role of council is to consider the package that's offered, not necessarily to accept it. So it says there is responsible for formal acceptance of the contributions, but I think more our role is to consider what's proposed.
Mayor Richmond, through you, we certainly can capture that sentiment. That's a good comment. I think what we were trying to achieve in that statement is that what I said earlier, that staff will negotiate, but it is council absolutely who accepts or not an amenity package. So although council may not be involved in every step of the negotiations, it's not something that can be set by staff. So we can certainly take that comment and look at adding that sentiment for sure.
So, Mr. Chalmers, you said that your suggestion would be to develop the companion list for priorities outside of the actual policy?
Mayor Richmond, through you, I think given the scale of some of the amenities that are in that list, and given the scale of development that happens annually in the community and the level of contributions you will draw, I would suggest that the community develop that list of aspirational things like a swimming pool or what you might have, and consider amenity contributions as one source of revenue for that. So you get grant opportunities, how other ways. And I think the tendency might be to push things into the amenity pile that might be unattainable in the short to medium term. So I think through additional work, you could look clearly at what the community needs and wants and what role community amenities plays in that. And if it is something that's to be funded entirely by amenities and a large project comes through and can carry that burden, then absolutely you could shuffle it around. But again, it's to maintain some level of flexibility for the amenity tool. The reality is council's priorities can change and ebb and flow. We've certainly seen an indication of that over the last few months. And so maintaining some flexibility there might be beneficial to council to allocate the funds as they see fit.
Go ahead, Lisa.
May I add to that? Well, we do have a list of community amenities in our official community plan at this point. It's been included in Appendix D to the report. And it is anticipated that we would be updating that list through our OCP review.
Okay.
But I think your question was, why would it live outside of the policy?
Well, that's part of the question, because I
Policy.
understand, the comments you both made. I just think it's also important to have some direction for amenity funds, as opposed to a pot of money that sits there and can get sort of picked away at. This is to me, this is strategic money that comes through the development community as our community grows. So I think it's important to have some direction for those funds. I understand the idea of having flexibility, and I'm happy if it lives outside this document in a separate document. But I think it is good for council to consider, and every council, right? And like Mr. Chalmers said, council priorities change as well. There's an ebb and flow. So I think it's something that should be brought back every few years, or at least once a term, to make sure that the amenities are in line with the council's vision and the community's vision at that time. But I think having some sort of direction, some sort of framework to say this is where the money goes, it's served us well with recreation over the past. Whether it's affordable housing, that's another, good direction. But I think one ends up being a little more strategic about how they spend those amenities. So I'm quite happy to explore a list on the side. I could see why it would come through the OCP discussion as well, but I'm glad that we're taking the step with the policy. I'm glad we've cleaned this up. It's been on the books, as you say, for a number of years. I personally, and I'd like to hear from the rest of council, would like to see that companion list developed, not tomorrow, but sooner than later, so that it does accompany this policy and it's all new. So that's my thought on that.
Mayor Richmond?
Go ahead, and then I've got Mr. Chalmers.
Yeah, I agree with your comments there. And that companion list may be for smaller projects that if they were on the table when staff were negotiating with rezoning, there may be something on there that could be taken off of that list and done immediately without money being put aside for what we say are major projects like a skating rink or a swimming pool. So I don't think it would hurt to have that as a companion list to this agreement so that they can refer back to that. So I certainly would be happy to see that also.
Mr. Chalmers, did you have a comment?
Yeah, Mayor Richmond, certainly, and it may not have come as clearly through the policy as it should, and we can correct that. We did anticipate that there would be a council priority list, and whether that's determined annually through strategic planning or a budget cycle, or it's a list of priorities that comes out of policy documents, it could be appended to this. We imagine if we sat down to negotiate at a pre-application level, they would receive both of those. My experience with developers is that typically they can be quite generous if they have a good comprehension of where their funds are going. And the easy ones to fund are the ones that give the community, the local community around the development, some tangible benefit so they can actually see where their money is going. Into the general community amenity fund is usually a harder one to envision unless it's quite directed. So I do agree with both the sentiments of Councillor Craddock and yourself, Mr. Mayor, that having that list with some large aspirational goals and then some shorter term priorities, and it could be as simple as providing some direction around where trails sit on that versus affordable housing versus park space versus developed recreation. Just, it helps guide the discussion. So there will absolutely need to be that piece, and it is anticipated to work very closely with this policy. We just didn't think the approach of listing on that all out and then taking kind of a levy approach as a target was the right solution for here right now.
Thank you. Jeannie?
I was just going to mention through you, Mayor Richmond, that the Pemberton's needs for amenities have been listed in the report starting on 47. So I have outlined the list that comes out of our OCP, from our Parks and Open Spaces Master Plan, our 1 Mile Lake Master Plan, our Agricultural Parks Master Plan, our draft Public Art Policy, and the Village of Pemberton Cycling Network Plan. So I think that companion list could be assembled quite quickly because I have already basically put that out in a table format in this report. And I don't know if this is worth mentioning, but sometimes developers can come to the table with their own idea of what might be an amenity for the Village of Pemberton that we might not have thought of ourselves. So I think there should be, a bit of openness to explore if they did have a particular amenity contribution in mind.
No, I agree, and I'm happy to leave that flexibility in there for that reason. I think there's also a lot of times when there's a development happening, the developer, if the amenity they're building benefits the residents of their development, they're much happier to be able to invest in it and maybe invest even further in it. So I think having that flexibility is really important. So any other questions on the report?
I have no questions.
Okay, so maybe we can get a couple motions here. Can we get the first a motion that council support the draft policy establishing guidelines for negotiating community amenity contributions on a case-by-case basis, and that's direct staff to seek input from the development industry on the understanding that going forward the village will use a combination of negotiations and amenity zoning where most applicable. Moved by
Move the motion.
Kazan, second by Councillor Noble. Further discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Do we want to put a motion then to have staff come back? It doesn't have to be huge, or like Mr. Genie said, that table's there, the amenities are there. But normally I would suggest a committee of the whole. But if we're not going to hold a committee of the whole, then a regular council meeting to talk about that companion list and what this council sees as priorities, big and small. Somebody like to make that motion?
I'll do that.
Motion.
Gaddick, seconded by Councillor Noble. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Any closing comments on that?
I would just like to say that we could bring that back when we get some information from the development community and bring back the final policy for adoption. We could also bring back the companion list at that time.
Perfect.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Ms. Virginia, Mr. Chalmers. Thanks for that. We're going to move on to operations. We got Mr. Zimat, who's going to give us our 2019 drinking water annual report. Is he online? There he is.
Hello, good morning, Mayor and Council.
Good morning.
Morning.
There he
Can you
is.
see me now?
Now we can. I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Okay, yes, I'm here today to present to you the Pemberton 2019 Drinking Water System Annual Report. So just keep in mind that this is a report on the water system for the year 2019. Even though we're well into 2020, this is submitted to Vancouver Coastal Health, and it's designed to inform our consumers of the status of our water. So I will present the report to you now. Basically, it's an overview. It starts off with consumption for the Village of Pemberton, which, if you look at Table 1 in the report, shows a comparison this year's consumption compared to last year and the year prior. We went up about 38 cubic meters per day from last year, but that's still actually less than 2017, for a total of 10,000 cubic meters over the year increase. We attribute that to just minor climatic changes or population growth. It's relatively minor, and as I mentioned, it's still lower than 2017's consumption. As for chlorination, the goal is to have the target chlorine residual at 0.2 milligrams per liter. Our average for the year was 0.28. The high on the year was 0.36 and the low was 0.08. So we're pretty much right on target there. As for water chemistry, we test this annually. The test was done in February of 2019, checking for total metals, volatile organic compounds, and trihalomethane. The testing results came back relatively good. We test for well 3, Oak Street, and the Industrial Park. All of the levels were within the acceptable concentrations. However, our emergency backup well number 2, which I have briefed council about before, has actually exceeded the aesthetic objective for both iron and manganese. There are new aesthetic objectives and maximum acceptable concentrations of manganese, and we are approaching the the aesthetic objective on well 3 as well for manganese. So this is one area that we're paying particular attention to. And actually my assistant manager, David Ward, will be presenting to you a report in camera regarding this. Next is the corrosion control. As you know, in 2016, we implemented water treatment for acidity, pH. So this is a constantly measured and adjusted level to try and get the pH to 7 and alkalinity to range between 40 and 80 milligrams per liter, which we've been maintaining that target. Despite this, we also include in this report a flush message, direct verbatim from Vancouver Coastal Health on their recommendation to flush the water before use. You can see that there in the flush message section, but essentially it's just a reminder to all users to always flush the water until you feel a change in temperature, cold water running through the tap, to only use cold tap water for drinking and cooking purposes, especially for infants, like formula preparation, and just to remove any potential risk of consuming lead from pipe fixtures and fittings. As I said, we do treat for corrosion control, so that shouldn't be a problem, but it's still a recommended message that we pass on to the users. The last section is on cross-connection control. In 2018, we passed the cross-connection control bylaw, and we've been continuously rolling it out. This year, we've already sent out letters to industrial users throughout the village, requiring them to submit their results. Many of them already do test their cross-connection control devices, but however, this program is a way to track and keep track of who's testing and get the test results. So that program is ongoing. The last section is on bacterial analysis. So this we sample weekly from Oak Street, the village office, the health center, the treatment plant, Pemberton Plateau, the industrial park, Collins Road, Pemberton Meadows Road, Pemberton Farm Road, and Earl Road. And those test results are posted on Vancouver Coastal Health's website, but they're also included in the appendix of this report. That is all from the report. I recommend that council receive the 2019 drinking water system annual report. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Questions?
Mayor Richmond?
Go ahead.
And I'm just throwing this out for council because it would have to come for council, but reading the report, I'm quite concerned about the level of good water that we're getting from subsurface at this present time. The last well we tried didn't work out very well. I'm just wondering if it would be a recommendation that we take a look at some surface water testing on Pemberton Creek, just to see what the value is of that water. And if it's good, maybe in the future we can incorporate mixing some of that water with the groundwater. I think we have to move forward on this. We can't keep drilling wells and costing a lot of money without finding good water. So it seems to be a source that we used to use, and maybe if the cost to test that surface water isn't expensive, it would be nice to know what the value is there.
Wilmer?
I'll start off, and then if Tom has anything to add, I'll let him to fill in the gaps. So we do have on the books a plan to identify another source, which does look at surface and Pemberton Creek specifically. Also looking at the Green, the Lillooet, the Miller, to look at where we may be able to, and the Birkenhead, to see where we can possibly look at an alternative source. I do recall that when we were dealing prior to pH, when we were investigating how we were going to deal with our corrosion issue, we did have some preliminary conversations with Vancouver Coastal Health. They're not 100% supportive of looking at surface water. And they did indicate that there would be a significant upwards of $10 million for treatment that comes off of Pemberton Creek. That's not to say that it's not an option. but it has been identified as another source. It's not in this particular document, but it is something that we are currently exploring. So we do have plans to look at that, and we will be bringing back a more comprehensive, detailed report or study for council to consider.
And would it be expensive at all just in the meantime, just to do some water sampling to see what the value of the water is there?
I think it goes further. The turbidity is a big issue on Pemberton Creek. Not so much the water quality, but you need to treat for that turbidity aspect of it. So I think it goes more complex, but it will be something we will be looking at. We can definitely take that offline, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than just the water quality.
Thank you.
Don, did you want to add to that?
No, I think Nikki nailed it on the head there. We have tested the water from Pemberton Creek, and turbidity is the major deterrent from using it. It would involve quite a bit of treatment. As Nikki said, we'd be talking in the range of possibly $10 million for a treatment plant. As I said at the start, this is more of a summary report on the quality results, which have all been within the acceptable range. I did mention that well too, we've seen an increase in manganese and iron, and in fact, it's actually gone down in iron in the most recent samples. One of the recommendations we're making in our other report that will come to you shortly is to increase testing of our current wells as well, because you mentioned, Councillor Craddock, that we've been exploring other possibilities for wells, and we want to have a better idea of our results. So we're going to be testing from an annual basis, which is what's required, to monthly. But again, we can talk about that more in the system analysis report that will be presented to you shortly. This, I just want to remind you, this is more of a qualitative results from 2019, which all of our results are within specifications. So,
any more questions? Can I get a motion to receive, please?
Motion to receive.
Seconded by Councilor Noble. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thanks, Tom.
thank you very much.
Okay. On to the mayor's report. A couple meetings to report on. I had a meeting with Minister Robinson as scheduled. Just two quick things to talk about there. One, we've already talked about a little bit, is the ministerial orders. That was a big part of the conversation, but the format of our meetings is changing. So we're going to continue meeting with Minister Robinson and some of the other ministers regularly, but I've been on calls with mayors from all over the Lower Mainland on these calls. So they're going to try to divide it up a little bit more for future calls and meetings with like communities. So communities of similar size, communities of similar nature. So resort municipalities, towns of our size. So they want to keep the conversation going, the dialogue going during relaunch and see how we're all doing as this pandemic progresses and check in, but we're going to do it as smaller groups. Yeah, not much else came out of that meeting. Had a meeting with the MLA and the MP. Again, a lot of conversation around the CERB versus the wage subsidy. Both of them have been extended to the end of August. Yeah, nothing great out of there. We had our first task force meeting on relaunch and recovery. This was on June 18th. And as you know, there's 11 of us on the committee, and what an awesome group of people. It was a fairly introductory meeting. Everybody did some self-introduction, sort of explain why they wanted to be part of the committee as well as what they bring to the table. It was a 2-hour meeting, and we had a good conversation about how we want to proceed as a group. We want to be strategic and thoughtful. We want to respond and make sure we're doing the work that we think the community wants us to do to work on through this committee. We also want to keep it moving. So we didn't want to jump in, and so there's a lot of discussion about how we make sure we're doing right by the community. In other words, what you know, how do we go to the community and get some input from them? So there's discussion around that. And then just again, the format as to how we proceed as a group. A couple of our members are experienced facilitators, very different styles and backgrounds, but very strong facilitators. So we've been working on the side a little bit to develop a bit of a format for how we proceed and develop the principles of this committee. And we're meeting, I believe it's on Thursday morning, to discuss this. And then our next Mayor's Task Force meeting will be next week. So again, trying to be strategic and thoughtful without, you know, we want to get moving. Recovery, as I keep saying, is right now. So trying to find a balance in that. We want to make sure that we're on the right track. I'm going to mute you for a second here. Sorry about that. And it's interesting. I mean, it's like I said, a great group of people. And it's very broad deliberately, as we wanted it to be. We wanted to cover everything from, again, the social fabric to mental health to tourism and business. And I think that'll provide a bit of a challenge for us at the same time to figure out how we work so that, you know, everybody's well represented. All aspects are well represented, but we're not too broad and we're not too spread out. So great meeting. Looking forward to carrying on that work next days and weeks. June 24th, I had a regional district meeting. Again, talked about the ministerial order. We did the same thing at the regional district as we did here at the village. You know, there's 10 directors, so same thing. The board room there isn't able to hold everybody at this point. So we're still working on that. A couple small, not small notes, but notes. The Braylorn Sewer Project, and it's not in our little area here, but it's been a big project for that area and it's pretty near completion. There was a few dollars allocated from the PILT funding in that region to complete it. So it's almost done, which is very exciting for that area. The transfer station AAP was discussed and moved forward. So that's happening. Part of the discussion on the transfer station was how we can make sure, since we're looking towards a new transfer station that will hopefully reduce our landfill, how we can get zero waste for the construction industry as well. So trying to make sure this facility allows for the construction industry in the area to work at a zero waste level as well. Then we talked about the Whistler Olympic Park campsites, and I've mentioned this on a couple of occasions. I believe it's 46, 23 drive-in, 23 walk-in campsites. We had given it first reading. We were waiting on second reading to get some comments from Whistler. We didn't really get many new comments. It was agreed from the board to go second reading and send it out to the community for input. Stakeholders, tenure holders, anybody who has a stake in it in that area. And then there was a motion put forward on a recommendation to waive the public hearing on this. The rationale was that it fits within the OCP and that under current conditions, due to the fact that it fits under the OCP, we would look for other means to get input from the public. Myself, I opposed that motion, although it does fall in line with the OCP. I feel like it is a significant land use decision to add 46 campsites up there. And I think that there are members of the public that are going to want to be able to speak to it through a public hearing. There will be the opportunity to speak to it through, letters and other input. But I personally felt that it was important to have a public hearing on this. So there was a long discussion about it. The motion ended up dying with a 5-5 vote, and we have then introduced another motion to go ahead with the public hearing, which we did. Britannia Oceanfront Development Corporation, there's a housing agreement that I've mentioned before, just to make sure that affordable housing allowances are being met. And so I won't go into great detail because I have talked about it, but the changes that the board asked for were made and it was adopted. Then the Tiger Bay development application came up as part of the agenda. Tiger Bay used to be Taiching. It's the biggest development down in the Britannia area. This came to the board a number of times in different forms over the years, going back to, I think, 2016 or 2017, like prior to that. And it kept coming back in little bits and pieces. And at that point, the board, and I was on the board at that point, we had a conversation and said, and directed staff saying, we don't want to see this application again until 9 conditions are basically met. So those, and I'll go through them really quickly. And this is a major development. This is 1,000 units. You know, we're talking, you know, over 2,000 people down in that area ultimately, which we know what that looks like. That's a lot of people. So we're trying to be very careful about it. It's a development, as we know, that's been on the books for years, and it keeps changing. It's changed shape a few times. So I'll just go through quickly the conditions that the board put forward and where we ended up ultimately. But the first was to make sure that there's a CN Rail crossing to allow access to Menendee Bay and Menendee Park. It's always been important to the board that there's full public access to that park and that water. And that was number one. So we didn't want to see it unless that public access has been provided. And this is the interesting thing about some of these conditions. They have been discussed, they've been met to a certain degree, they've made allowances for them, but I felt, and some others felt, that some of them were just sort of still too high level discussion. So for instance, the CN Rail crossing, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, because CN won't do that bit until the development is approved by local government. And so it's sort of a back and forth thing. So it's not really nailed down. Another example is, well, I'll just go through the conditions again. So that's the first one, was that rail crossing. The second is about secondary suites. They've removed the secondary suites that were up for discussion from the plan. So it's a little bit moot. There was a discussion about townhouse suites, whether they would be allowed. And I'll just jump over. One of the big conversations we had about this development was ensuring that there is a good variety of housing, that we ensure that there's a good mix, so that it's a good social mix within the communities there. One of the requirements is that they agreed to 50 purpose-built rental apartments, non-market. Since that requirement was put in, when we reviewed the RGS, and the new requirement through the RGS is 15% should be allocated from affordable housing. So there's discussion through this, and condition number 9, which was some other purpose-built rental units, but market, not the non-market. So they would do, the plan is at this point, what they're agreeing to is a minimum of 10% purpose-built rental markets for the market, purpose-built rental units for the market, and then 5%, which is the 50 apartments, non-market, and that allows for the 15% affordable housing as required through the RGS. Some better communication if they're going to go live with this application again. Prior to the public hearing is one of the conditions, that they really engage all the neighboring communities there. And then 5 condition was a big one that I've been hammering, which is a bit of a transit strategy. So they've agreed to a transit hub, potential to tie into regional transit, shuttles to other local areas, and potentially some investment in infrastructure to support a local or a regional transit system. So this is one of those that we felt was a little bit still vague. It wasn't much of a commitment. We would like them to submit so what we asked was that they submit their public transit plan in much greater detail prior to going to a public hearing. So what we're trying to do is flush out some of these things. Like I say, they seemed a little bit high level or vague. So we're trying to flush out some of these things so that we can have good discussion before it gets in a form that gets presented at a public hearing. Highway improvement plan, access, traffic impact assessment. They're working with MOTI. So again, they're working with, but haven't seen much. Secured waterfront access, tenure, getting tenure over Menendee Bay. And the last one is employment lands. So the concern was they were building a community of over 2,000 people ultimately, and there was very little actual employment land on this development. So we're essentially building a community of 2,000 people that we're putting on the road. There's no school in the early going. There's very little business. So we're essentially building a commuter community, which I struggle with. So we said we wanted to see a high percentage of employment land so more people could work there and live in this community. So what they've come up with is a surf park. They would like to consider putting a surf park in there and then having accessory hotel, restaurant. And the other thing is they want to have a couple of other lodges and glamping units. So it's very tourist oriented. Surf park is a training area and recreation area for surfers. And then again, you know, the accessory hotel and restaurant, camping, they feel that'll supply up to 400 to 600 jobs. So myself and another board member started to ask a lot of questions about environmental impact. What does a surf park actually look like? And it was also felt that all these jobs, as you know, that would be provided through the employment suggested, are very much looking at the same demographic for employees as, say, Whistler and Squamish. A lot of that hospitality, entry level, low. I don't want to say lower wage. I mean, there's lifeguards, there's lots of other, you know, administration involved in this sort of thing, but it would be a lot of youthful type jobs, so to speak. And so again, one of the board members was concerned about that, you know, that's not enough, that there needs to be, you know, a better variety of jobs available within this community. So the conditions were, I won't say met, but they were acknowledged and discussed, and we were given an update. So the board felt that that still wasn't quite where we want to go. Again, we want to flesh out more before going to a public hearing. So there was a motion to refer to staff to review the application, refer it to a committee of the whole, so we can have a better conversation about all these items, flesh them out even more, and also to refer the application and these conditions to the RGS steering committee. So Ms. Pedrini's not on the line, but you can expect a call on that one again soon. So yeah, a lot of discussion, but again, this is a huge comprehensive development. So I think it's really important we put the time into it. Last item that I want to mention from the regional district, similar to us, there was an approval to fast track temporary liquor patio extensions. Attended a regional hospital district meeting. As I reported to you guys last meeting, prior to that, we had a meeting where we discussed the budget. We had a presentation from Karen Olson from VCH, who made a very compelling case for the needs that were being requested from our hospital district budget. After much conversation, it was agreed to fund pretty much most of what was brought to the table by VCH. It's kind of late in the cycle, and we've decided to fund that. But as I've mentioned to you guys before, there was another big discussion about how we fund priorities through the hospital district. There's still a sense that we're just basically filling in the gap for VCH and again, it's important work that they're asking support for, but we feel like that work should be done through the health authority and through the ministry in the province. And we keep finding ourselves in this situation where we feel compelled to fund it. So to get ahead of it for the next budget cycle, we have put a motion forward where we're going to, and some plans to engage our local public health providers, to engage our hospital district foundations, our health foundations in the corridor, and really try to understand, and the community at large, to really understand what is it that people feel are their biggest needs here for healthcare, and we feel we'll be able to make better decisions as a board in terms of how we put our budget moving forward. Yesterday I had a meeting with the Pemberton Valley Emergency Management Committee. Most of the meeting was to give us the final report from NHC. I've mentioned this before as well, the Northwest Hydraulics report on flood protection. They'd given us I gave you guys a high level report on this a few months ago, but basically we just walked through the recommendations and priorities from the report. We talked about all the different structural projects. So the Miller-Lillooet Dike upgrade that we've discussed in the past. The final seismic study, I guess, will be coming out next week. But at this point, it does not look like we're going to make seismic standards to be able to upgrade that dike the way the province would like to see us upgrade it, using the grant money that we applied for. Again, we will know for certain the end of the next week. If that is the case, then the province is aware that we would change gear and use that grant application or those grant funds to do Arn Canal upgrades, which are very important as well. So both important projects, but yeah, we'll find out what the seismic report is next week. It looks like we'll be steering towards the Arn Canal, and we'll have to continue working towards the Miller-Lillooet upgrade, perhaps at a political level, to see if we can get around some of these requirements so we can protect people on that dike. Pole Yard Dike, the Newton Nation got a grant for that section of dike. That construction will take place in 2021. Sediment removal is ongoing. One of the things that was discussed is that the province sort of would like to see us be able to measure the value of the sediment removal, so to be able to see whether this is actually having a positive effect, because it's an expensive project every year. So NHC will talked about doing channel flow surveys and channel profile surveys. They explain that it's really hard to measure year over year because of the way things change, but they figure if they put into place these channel profile surveys over time, that it would be really helpful. The Arn has been backing up over the high water over the last week here. So again, Kevin, the operation manager, was clear about how important it is to get better shut-off gates along there and do that job as well, that project as well. And we, there was discussion through this report of some really big sort of high-level projects that we may or may not want to consider over the years and looking ahead. So everything from like a setback dike option for the village and for Mount Currie. It's expensive, but we want to explore it just to know what our options are. There's also discussion around the Birkenhead River, some of the sediment buildup and rechanneling that's going on there, and they need to keep looking at that project. And then Kevin spoke of the importance of having more flow gauges. And I've mentioned this before, but can we, he figures we could start on the Ryan. That's the lowest cost one, and we could start there. But he feels that having flow gauges on the Miller and the Green would really lend more information to just having it on the Lillooet and give us much better actual monitoring and allow us, to judge better what evacuation triggers are along the rivers. It would be much more accurate. So he'd like to incorporate that into the plan moving forward. And then got into some more operational stuff, including building regulations that are coming, recommendations that are coming out of this report, everything from FCLs, flood construction levels, discussion of the Lillooet sediment trap up, up the valley, and all those recommendations. So basically what's going to happen next is Kevin is going to sort of prioritize in terms of priority and also in terms of reality, in terms of what projects we want to look at. The committee is going to get together again, like we did last time, and see what work each community wants to do and how we, again, join forces or divide and conquer to go after the grants and hit the high priority projects on there. So I think that was a really positive meeting. And I think that's all I've got for you. Any council reports?
Just before you go ahead, if I might, Mayor Richmond.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just on the project in Britannia, I know a number of years ago, part of that project incorporated a First Nations marina. Is that still on the books for that area?
There was no discussion of that.
Okay, thank you. And as far as a report, if I might, a couple of weeks ago, I brought to the table that 1 Mile Lake Boardwalk needed some upgrading, some boards replaced. It had holes in it. I just want to thank Nikki and staff that within that 2-week period that's been done, and the safety factor has been repaired. So thank you for that.
Nice. Any other council reports?
I'd just like to say that staff did a good job on improving the visibility by the IDA with taking the grasses out and putting in shorter plants. And I recently heard we now have a taxi service in Pemberton as of Friday,
I didn't know that.
just this previous Friday started.
And that's out a taxi service, or is it the ride hailing that we were looking at?
It's a taxi service. I believe the gentleman that runs it is Drew, that I think he also has a pizza place in town.
I don't
Drew
think he has a
Arnold.
pizza place, but
Yeah.
yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Well, he parks in front of it with his taxi. You'll see it up there.
Sheena?
Yeah, it's a gentleman by the name of, I believe, Mike Woodley, who has established not only a taxi service, but a towing business as well, that the companies, they're doing the two things. And the taxi service they're starting slowly through word of mouth, but it is called Mountain, I can't remember now, but there you'll see the tow truck that is affiliated with that out and about. Mr.
I think
Bank.
it's Mountain View.
Mountain View, that's what I wanted to say, Mountain View Taxi, yes. So this has been something that has been in the works now for quite a number of months as they work through logistics, and they did get their taxi license approval, and business license was issued a couple of months ago, and it's just taken them some time to get set up, and I believe they've got another driver coming online in the next couple of weeks.
Excellent. Any other council reports?
Richmond?
Councilor Zant?
I just wanted to mention I also attended the Mayor's Task Force meeting, and I have to say I was impressed with staff's choices for the people that are on the task force. And big thanks to all the staff, Ms. Gilmore, Ms. Fraser, Ms. Brooksbank, and Ellie for setting that all up for us. It was good. I was really impressed with everything everybody had to say, and looking forward to the next meeting on next Monday, I think.
Anybody else? Okay. We don't have any bylaws, so we're on to correspondence for action. The first is from Justin Penny regarding parking for residents, commercial property owners of Expedition Station. Any discussion here, or the recommendation is to refer to staff for response?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Just reading through the letter, and I'm just curious, is the current parking correct for what it was zoned for initially? So they're asking for more parking than what it was zoned for initially?
I think part of the issue here is when Expedition Station first came in, it was supposed to be live work units. So they were strata titled for the unit above and the unit below. But they met the parking requirements at the time. So many of these units have subsequently, I guess, de-stratified. And so there's a unit above and a unit below. So unfortunately, there is no, in fact, the municipality doesn't receive notification when, or has to authorize when a de-strating, if that's not really a right word, but happens. So we have been experiencing some significant issues. As we know in Pemberton, many of us have maybe more than one vehicle or larger vehicles with sleds or other kinds of, I guess, toys, if you will. And we haven't looked necessarily to see how people are utilizing their garages, which are around the back. But at this point, we have been dealing with a number of people parking on that road for a significant amount of time. And we have gone back to, and it's actually impacted the museum's parking as well. So it's kind of a bunch of issues all rolled in together, unfortunately.
Ms. Fraser?
If I may just further to the CAO's comments, that development did receive a variance and a reduction in parking when it was initially approved. And some extra parking was to be allocated on the lot next door. And I believe that lot has now since sold. And so that extra parking, I think it was 1 or 2 spaces, or maybe 3, are no longer available for use by the residents. And as to reiterate Ms. Gilmore's comments respecting the use of the garages, I would hazard a guess that very few of those garages are actually being used to park vehicles. So as a result, the overflow goes out onto the municipal right-of-ways and into the municipal parking areas. So we've been trying to work with the owners in that area for about 4 years now. So we can certainly look at options.
Thank you. Any other questions? I get a motion to refer to staff for response.
Make a motion to refer.
Councillor Noble, second by Councillor Zant. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Next letter is about concerns over the installation of 5G telecommunications technology in Pemberton. Go ahead, Nikki.
I did actually, this came up a few council meetings ago, and I did reach out to both Shaw and TELUS representatives. What I have received is that we don't currently have 5G. They're saying at this point, they don't expect it to be built anytime soon. There are some 5G trials happening right now, and it would be likely to be rolled out first in urban centers. What I heard from both TELUS and Shaw is that if any new, obviously this technology has come from 1G to 2G to 3G to 4, and it is evolving, but they're a federally regulated telecommunications provider and would need to adhere to all of the protocols that are established. Let me see here. In compliance with Health Canada's health and safety guidelines. So they did give me sort of a block piece of information that we could share. But that's the extent that they have right now, as they haven't officially rolled it out.
Okay. Go ahead, Councillor Antonelli.
I think it's something that we should be looking at. I think the letter raised an interesting point about consent, and then the Rideau letter below talked about what municipalities can do to, I guess, engage and try to regulate and reduce impacts. So I think it's something that we should be tracking over time and looking at where we can weigh in.
I think I don't disagree. I would be curious to know how we would be notified and when that opportunity would be and who we need to. So we probably need a little bit more information. As we've found in the past, a lot of these companies don't require municipal authorization for this to all take place. So we would need to look a little bit more as to when they might look at rolling this out to be able to provide feedback.
But I wonder, like, how do we make sure that we get a heads up, a proper heads up, so we could have a conversation within our community whenever that happens, whether it's next month or in 5 years, before, you know, like you said, they don't have to consult with local municipalities before they start putting in that kind of infrastructure. And that's the concern that you hear from many people. They're just going ahead and doing it. So you've confirmed that at this point, they're not putting in any infrastructure in here now, which is great to know. But it would be nice to be able to have a conversation before they do it and have a proper heads up. So I don't know if that's through.
I think we need to talk to our MP if
That's
where
what I
we
was
want
going
to
to say. Yeah, I think it's that level. Okay. Let me, I'll follow that up with Mr. Wheeler. Just to make sure that we're not blindsided by any of this. Okay, any further comments?
Refer to staff.
Second. Councillor Zant, all in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. And the last one for action is From Ms. Jones, Senior Director, BC Canadian Federation of Independent Business. The recommendation is that the correspondence be forwarded to the Pemberton District Chamber of Commerce and the Mayor's Task Force and Relief Committee. Somebody like to make that motion?
Make the motion.
Councillor Noble, second by Councillor Zant. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Correspondence for information. There are 5. Did anybody like to pull any of them out?
Motion to receive.
Seconder? Councillor Noble, any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Decision on late business. Late business, notice of motion, question period. So for those in attendance who do wish to ask a question, if you can click on the raise hand feature in the webinar controls, village staff will then see that and will announce your name when it is your turn, and you'll be prompted to unmute your microphone at that point. Please be reminded that only questions directly related to business discussed during the council meeting are permitted. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
Mayor Richmond, I don't see any questions.
We'll give it a half a sec here in case people are fumbling with their buttons. So any questions for question period?
There's only staff in attendance.
All right then. Okay, then I will entertain a motion to go in camera.
Second.
Okay, Councillor Caddick, Councillor Noble, all in favor. We're going to go in camera. Do you want to take 5 or 10?
Okay. Now you're recording.
Okay, that's it. And no rise from report. Can I get a motion to adjourn the regular? Councillor Zant, second by Councillor Noble, all in favor. Opposed, motion carries. And then we're going to